Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brendiger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Ben Patton. I'm going to let Ben tell us who he is and why the work that he does matters. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for
Well,
joining me today.
thank you, Ed. Yeah, my background, obviously, I come from a heck of a lot of military. There's obviously my grandfather, the rather famous or infamous George S. Patton Jr. of World War II fame, and my dad, his son, who was Major General George S. Patton. He got rid of the Roman numeral four when his father died, but he actually I wrote a memoir about him called Growing Up Patton about a decade ago, but he was even more decorated than his father was and even saw more frontline combat time. But anyway, so and also on my mother's side, there's six generations going back to the class of 1812 in West Point of West Pointers and two chiefs of cavalry and a Medal of Honor recipient. So she, before the Pattons came along, she was from a pretty famous family. So anyway, my background is psychology, developmental psychology, and filmmaking. And about 15 years ago, I was running film camps for teenagers, which I always wanted to teach kids, and I always was interested in film. And so I married the two together. I hooked up with some very much smarter people than I, and we did them in Colorado and Massachusetts over about 8 summers. And I very quickly started to see that people, the kids between, let's say, 13 and 18, were making films about identity, about their changing adolescent identity. And I started all the things that happen to you as an adolescent, your first kiss, your first pimple, getting picked on, all those things. And so I started to make the connection between that and veterans coming back from being downrange and often transitioning out of the military and what they were dealing with in terms of creating a new identity or what people call their new norm. And since then, that was about 15 years ago. We've done about 110 workshops, 1,500 vets, maybe 400 films all over the place, and including in Israel. And now we are really focused on a moderate contract we have with the VA to work in high suicide areas, primarily in the Rockies, to do these workshops with isolated veterans that are not often enrolled in the VA, enrolled in any kind of mental health support. And this is sort of a powerful, which I can talk more about, but it's a powerful sort of mechanism for helping them in many ways change their attitude toward themselves so they can step forward into a new life.
Fascinating. What is it that you see in their stories which um, makes it difficult for them to transition
Well,
into
I
the?
mean, everybody knows a lot of it. I mean, they come back and they're a sniper and they think they don't feel like any of these skills translate. They can't get a job. I don't think it's ever true that no matter what you do, if you learn how to command men and arrive at work on time and you know what I mean, and press your uniform and just do what you're told and follow orders and you know what I mean and lead, I think you are able to you should be able to transition to a lot of places. But a lot of them come back kind of messed up with post-traumatic stress and don't know their family the way they did when they left. They're somewhat changed. They're less comfortable making that transition into a new mysterious, foreboding world of civilian life, even though for most of their lives they were civilians and now they're civilians again. And so I think that they're just very reluctant to share things because they don't know how they'll be received, and so they tend to isolate. And the ones that tend to isolate are the ones that end up hurting themselves or trying to. And there's 400,000 of those in from the war on terror that have came back with post-traumatic stress and do not seek medical care or have medical care. And there's about 60,000 in the area that we're working. And there's a very high suicide rate. It's not 22 anymore, it's about 17, but it's increasing in the under 30 age group. And it's really startlingly high.
Have they have they have the psychologists, I guess, is or whoever it is, the experts, have they figured out what it is about combat that causes the trauma?
Well, there are a lot of things. I mean, getting shot at would traumatize me or anybody at Newtown or Uvalde or Las Vegas. I think there's certainly a lot of moral injury, particularly as the national interest becomes less clear. I think in Vietnam, it began to be very clear. In Persian Gulf, it was very clear. In World War II, it was clear. Korea, somewhat. But I mean, in the war on terror, most of the veterans that I meet that have been deployed a number of times come back and they say, all I want to do is get my troops home. It's not so much about I want to beat the Germans or something, or kill the bad guys or save America. So I think a lot of that is moral injury, certainly.
Is there a
And a lot
is
of
there
them, and a lot of them have TBIs and things like that,
yeah.
traumatic brain injuries, and so they're not thinking correctly.
Is there a disconnect between the nation as sort of an ideal and what they're doing in war?
Well, you probably could say as much as you probably know that answer as well as I do, being having, I'm sure everybody knows veterans, including yourself, and you are the son and grandson of a veteran. But um, I think there's certainly a disconnect. And there's also sort of I don't know if it's willful, but an ignorance on the part of civilians about their veterans. It's not the same as Vietnam when they were spitting on them and throwing rocks at them. But now we have other things to do. There's a small percentage of people that serve, and nobody's really focused on them. And I think the national interest issue, and this is somewhat political, has been much less clear in the last couple of decades. Why are we doing this? And what's our exit strategy, which is something that Patton and good leaders always have, an exit strategy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with you. I think that we were um, the reasons we were at war were never explicit, and the the, what I call the spectacle nature of it was very explicit in that there was something that we must do without there being kind of a rationale to it that the average person would understand, and particularly the average soldier would understand. And
Sure.
and and that to me is why what you're doing is compelling because I know you're trying. I mean, what I understand, I've looked at your website and I saw you. I encountered you on LinkedIn, so that's where I saw you for the first time, and I see that you're trying to address those traumatic needs that many veterans have. And I'm curious. So tell me about what you're doing and how that and how you came to do this. Because um, I mean, I'm assuming there's something related back to your father and your grandfather, but I doubt that it's simply that. I mean, is there something more to it? I would suspect.
Well, I mean, everyone hopes, I grew up in a family that said, you got to leave the world better than you found it. Until about age 17, all I wanted to do was be in the Navy and, drive ships and fly planes. And when I got to the door of those opportunities, I got into the Naval Academy Prep School, which is sort of a conduit, a feeder to
Uh-huh.
the Naval Academy. And I just blinked and I just thought, in my family, you can't just try it out. You got to go in like an NFL linebacker. And I just never had quite that burning desire and want to get hemmed to a career, for so long. Although it turns out it probably would have done me a lot of good to be in the military for a few years. But and so anyway, it took me till I was about 40 to get into about 30 to get into media. And as I said a moment ago, it started out with teaching kids, it evolved into working with vets, but it definitely was instilled in me to serve in some level. That doesn't mean you have to run a nonprofit. There are many ways you can serve. You're serving right now. But that was kind of what led me into it. And so to just sort of, if you want me to give you an overview of what we do, it's called the Patton Veterans Project. You can look it up as you have on pattonvets.org, see a few films that we've made. And basically, the way it works is there's maybe 15 to 20 vets are recruited, or, we attempt to get them into the classroom. It's difficult because they're reluctant to hang out with anybody, even other veterans in many cases. There's a lot of stigma associated with getting help, and if this is perceived as that, they often will just say no, they'll just wave off. But so they come into the room on a Friday night. We spend 3 or 4 hours with them. We teach them the elements of film. Why do we tell stories? How do we tell stories? Why do we tell stories? There's a lot of reasons to teach, to remember things, all that stuff, to validate our experiences. But I think in the case of veterans, one of the big reasons is to help make sense of things that don't make sense. I'll put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So your story makes some sense to you. And the how to tell stories, of course, there are many ways. You can tell narrative this way. I mean, well, in video is very powerful, of course, but theater and sculpture and diaries and music and poetry and writing and all those things. But in many ways, ours is a modality for this age, because the video camera is the most powerful, I think, and the most ubiquitous communications tool ever invented. I mean, every one of us, every adult has a practically that has any means at all has one in their pocket. And
Right.
so, and you can push a button and the world can see it. And the other
Right.
thing that's really interesting and significant about the medium of film or video is that it's collaborative. You can't really make a film by yourself. I often give a kind of what I think is a funny, dark, humorous example of the only guy that I know that made a film by himself was Grizzly Man. And look what happened to him. You know, that movie that came out a while ago where he got eaten by a bear. He was trying to film at the end of,
Yeah.
the road for him. But it's very collaborative. And I have a wristband on my hand, which says Patton Veterans Project, but on the other side it says listen, collaborate, empower, as you can see. And the listening is obvious. We listen to them for their stories. They listen to us on how to make films, and we collaborate together. And so after we teach them the basics of film, we do some silent film exercises. They come in, we break down some scenes of famous films, whether it's Witness or Whiplash or Forrest Gump. So they understand what makes an effective scene and what makes an effective film and all the variables that the filmmaker controls. For instance, even in this situation, you're controlling everything in your screen. It's you, or you're wearing glasses, you're wearing a blue shirt, you have a sexy, Moroccan sunset background or whatever it is. And so the same is true of a filmmaker within reason. And so then when they collaborate, if you imagine that even if you and I and a couple other people made a film, let's say about grief or transition or family, and it's a fictionalized sort of a composite of our experiences. It doesn't have to be your experience if you don't want to talk about it. You don't have to be in front of the camera. You don't even have to put your name in the credits. But if three or four of us make a film that channels some aspect of what we've experienced, imagine how many, and we don't know each other, imagine how many more people it might impact. So it might touch. So that's kind of the idea. They come out of it, they're transformed. I would say, as many people have said, including one chief of mental health here in the Bronx VA, said it kind of helps you see things from a different perspective. And once you can do that in a veteran, once you can make a veteran see things a different way, a struggling veteran, anything is possible. And then we track them longitudinally for a period of months with the help of the VA, and see if they're not getting help, open the door to them getting help. And you just want them, you can hold their hand for a while, but there's a point at which everybody has to take their own step. Even
Hmm.
if you're still holding their hand, they got to go into the deep end themselves and make a move. And I think we're something of a gateway toward that happening.
I like what you're saying because I think the visual representation of human experience has a powerful effect upon other people other than just yourself.
Right.
And the
Right.
question I have is, so what happens with these videos that are produced? What do you do with them?
Well, I mean, really, we wouldn't do anything with them if the veterans didn't give us permission to show them. But at the
Right?
end of each workshop, not at the beginning, after they've finished it, after they've screened it in front of the group, we ask them for permission to share it and to put it on YouTube and to use it at presentations. And maybe you're certainly welcome to put a couple on your website if you like, or what have you. And I have them on mine. So we want other people to see it, because the other element of our work, which is very important, is a screening that happens several weeks after a workshop. And that is a chance both for the veteran to be validated by showing their film, and also for to present it in front of other people and to realize, wow, I know more about this film than anybody because it's me. And it's also a chance to educate others, including family, friends, maybe community leaders that come to these public screenings. And they're usually 3 to 5 minutes long. And it can be very powerful to do that, and it puts them in the right direction. We fill the audience with people that are mental health experts and community leaders and family and friends. And one thing that I didn't mention, but we did do a fairly small study with the VA, but it showed that the The veterans that did our workshop, most of whom were in this study were in transition out of the military, had post-traumatic stress, had diagnosable post-traumatic stress, and were not getting mental health support. In many cases, they didn't want it. They took an appointment with the VA or some other mental health uh, entity within a few months of the workshop, and that's significant.
So are they not seeking help because there is some kind of sense that this is just more of the institution imposing itself upon me?
Well, a little bit. I think that there's a stigma. If you're a kick-ass Navy SEAL or an infantryman, the last thing you want people to do is think you're not tough. Even my grandfather
Um,
was like that.
yeah, that
And
makes sense.
although he had post-traumatic stress too, I mean, he famously slapped a couple of soldiers, which would have changed the course of some level of history in the Western theater had he not. I think he would have led Normandy. I think he would have done a lot of things differently than happened, and possibly the war would have ended more quickly. But of course, my name's Patton, not Eisenhower, but or Montgomery or Bradley. But there was a case between the wars, famously, where he was making, he was pretty bored in the 30s. I mean, they got rid of the tank corps. He was bumped from a colonel down to a major for 15 years. I mean, thought he was going to have to get out before he had a chance to really strut his stuff in war. And he knew the Germans and the Japanese were kicking up for quite a while. In fact, many years before anybody else did, I think. And he had a case where he was making beer in the garage, and he came back in uh, for dinner, and all of a sudden something exploded in the garage. Like, I don't know, just the beer blew up, and he hit the deck, hit the table, hit under the table immediately. And his daughters and his wife just kind of chuckled and said, "Oh my goodness." But that was sort of an element of that. My father had bits and pieces of that. There's a stigma. I can give you one example of a big study that was done with many vets and other people. I think it was over 1,000. And these are all people that attempted suicide unsuccessfully. And one of the questions they asked was, well, why didn't you? And then none of them had gotten help beforehand. Why didn't you seek out help? Why didn't you go to the VA or mental health, outpatient or a therapist or something? And they said, why would I go to the VA? I didn't need help. I was doing fine, which is kind of absurd.
I've seen that kind of behavior before, and not with vets, but from others who have had some kind of tragic circumstances in their life, and they think they have capacity to overcome it by sheer willpower, and they find that they can't, and
Hmm.
but they don't know that at the beginning, And I mean, I know it sounds odd to say it, but there's to their credit, they believe that they can overcome something, and maybe they can, but it really helps to have help to do that.
Well, again, it's about isolation.
Yeah,
Who can do anything by themselves without learning it, without,
yeah.
having somebody as a sounding board. There's very things we can do alone. Maybe Alex Honnold, who climbed, El Capitan or something like that by himself. But I mean, it really is,
We
we're
need each other.
we're gregarious, we're a social animal. So
So, is there anything, I mean, from your experience and from your family's experience, is there anything that can be done to better prepare uh, military uh, soldiers for combat, other
I
than
mean,
what they are already doing?
well, a lot of things. I mean, right now, they're prepared for combat in the sense that the military doesn't work unless everybody does what they're told. If the general says to the colonel, and the colonel says to the sergeant major, and the sergeant major says to the,
Right.
E4, you got to take that hill. If you don't take the hill, everything breaks down to a point. But when you have moral injury, it adds a new dimension to things. But I think there can be some prophylactic things, preventative and understanding what they're going to be doing. And certainly, understanding that they serve the Constitution, not the president. And if they don't feel comfortable with that, then with the president, then they either don't do it or they get out, so you don't have to, this is a democracy. You don't have to, you're not forced to serve in this day and age. But I think a lot of it has to do with how we treat them when they come out. Also, I think a lot of it falls on the president and the Congress to make sure that we enter wars where there's a clear national interest. And I think in many cases there isn't. And if there was after 9/11, it was certainly diluted. I mean, it's like, hey, we got bombed by Osama bin Laden's people, and then we invaded Iraq, which in retrospect, even though I was a big fan of it, and I have friends that died at 9/11, it in retrospect, it didn't really make much sense. When 10 years before they were saying you had, Colin Powell and Cheney, I remember specifically saying, why would we take out a two-bit dictator? We're just going to go in there and clean up Kuwait. You break it, you buy it. And of course they did break it and attempt to buy it, over the war on terror. So I think there's a lot of things we can do. I certainly think what we do is unique and incredibly powerful. And we're a relatively small organization, even for 15 years. We're starting to grow now that we've got more longitudinal data where we can track the veterans. But I want to raise millions of dollars and do this all over the world. We're actually doing workshops in Israel right now for
Oh,
Israeli soldiers and citizens that were attacked, and relatives of people that were killed or wounded or hostages at the music festivals and the kibbutzes. And that's somewhat political, or at least it's perceived that way, because we're not doing any with Palestinians right now. But that's just for lack of opportunity. Of course, I would love to do that. So that'll happen eventually. Because trauma is trauma. And in terms of other things that can be done on the way out, it's helping you. It's finding ways for you and I to better understand what our veterans are going through by
yeah.
watching these films, by meeting them, by engaging with them. I was always told as a kid that thank you for your service is an opening line, not a closing line. You
Yeah.
ask a question: where did you serve? What did you do?
Yes.
What was it like? And I always go up to the people, to the National Guardsmen in Grand Central Station here in New York, and just ask them, introduce myself. Sometimes I'll mention my father if I see a patch on their shoulder that indicates that they deployed and might have been with a unit he was involved with, and all that. So it's a lot of it is really sort of figuring out a way to empathize with these soldiers and servicemen and women from different branches. And I think we think of film as an empathy machine because it literally takes you inside of someone's head and puts you in a scene with somebody. And I think, again, trauma, I can't relate what it's like to have your best friend commit suicide in the military that served in Iraq with you or something, or Afghanistan. But I can relate to suicide in other ways, either through friends or in the case of an ex-wife and the mother of my child, who was, I think, 9 at the time. She committed suicide, and just one day. And so, trauma feels the same, even if it isn't the same in some cases.
What has been the response of families to what your participants have experienced?
Well, it's usually very positive. We do exit surveys from our screenings, and they're almost entirely, wow, I had no idea my husband had gone through this. This was incredible. I'm going to show this to my friends. All kinds of responses that are sort of incredulity that these things were happening and they didn't fully understand them, and a little bit of being ashamed that they haven't engaged with their veterans fully. So very positive,
Well, it has to be two ways, doesn't it? That,
certainly.
yeah. And that's maybe what a lesson to be learned from this is that both the family and the veteran need each other to be open to having that conversation, which
Hmm.
is both um, both intimate but also healing, because I think that's ultimately what the veteran wants without knowing that that's the language is some kind of healing so that they can go on with their life. And do you think that I don't know how to actually ask this question. Now, I know people who have done several tours into combat environments. Does that have a deeper effect than simply say one tour that someone had? I'm just asking because I don't know.
Multiple tours versus one tour.
Yeah.
Well, certainly there are people that have spent more time deployed in the last 20 years than they've been at home. I think certainly when you go back into the crucible of battle every time, I mean, again, I have never missed a meal or heard a shot fired in anger, but I would imagine that multiple tragedies or traumas can just have a multiple or have a multiplier sense and multiplier effect. And but then again, there's single traumas, particularly if you're younger or a civilian and not expecting that, not anticipating to get shot at, that it can be incredibly traumatic just for one. But yes, certainly.
So, what would you like the public to know and to do? And how do they support you in what you're doing?
Well, I mean, look, I've been doing this for a while, and only in the last 2 years since we got the validation, or 2 or 3 years of a clinical study and starting to work in high suicide areas with great positive impact, have I really felt comfortable that this is something that should be widely implemented, well beyond the military as well, in my opinion. In fact, in Israel, the first time we're working with civilians, the folks that have attended these, I mean, many of them are in Israel. Every male has to go in the military, and every woman has to either serve in the military or national service. So there are plenty of vets at these music festivals, but they're mostly civilians at the time, and so working with civilians has been great, with women, with families, and all that. But what I'd love to see, honestly, I'd love to get more PR like this. I'd love people to be aware of what we're doing. We started to put our films into film festivals and already gotten some awards. I'd like people to connect with me on LinkedIn, which is great because I've actually been putting out a number of posts about leadership, about my grandfather, about how I got into this, and about the work we do. And it's gotten me a number of connections and meetings. I think I've gotten over 1 million impressions in the last couple of months. I'd like people to go to our website at pattonvets.org, support it. Veterans, I'd like to have enroll in our workshops, and people that are people of means or connected with companies or foundations that live in areas with lots of vets. I'd love for them to reach out to me and see how we could put together some of these workshops in their area. We generally don't like to go to a place where we're only going to go once, because at first you're going to get any veteran and they may not even deployed. Although there are many people, I think more women than men, that have had assaults and things like that and been hazed in garrison when they're not deployed necessarily. And there are a great number of people that don't deploy, people that
Right.
process dead bodies when they come to Dayton, Ohio, or my grandfather always said an army runs on its stomach, and there are people that handle that part of things, and chaplains and whatnot. So not everybody deploys, otherwise you couldn't operate the military. But I'd love people to get in touch. I'd love people to say, hey, let's try to raise some money. Let's try to find a way to do workshops. They're not inexpensive. It's about $1,500 a veteran. But where it's scalable is through the screenings, through being able to push a button and show anybody in the world these films. We're going to have these films back in about a week. They'll be on our YouTube channel from Israel. They'll all be subtitled. It's going to be very powerful. So I think there's a lot of ways I'd love to have a couple $1 million in the bank right now, and we'd be able to save a lot more lives. Because I've had people come up to me in public forums, actually, and announce the fact that because of this workshop, they no longer want to take their own lives, or kill themselves. So there's a lot to be done. And also, I think that as I think I said before, our modality encompasses most other types of narrative therapy. There's 50,000 veteran NGOs out there, and I think we could collaborate with almost everyone.
It's fantastic. Um, I would love to interview some of them if they're willing. I mean, it would
Certainly.
be just like what we're doing.
We can
Um,
talk about that. I can give you some names of people, men, women, all branches of service but what I think I had an incomplete thought before, but any veteran can come to these workshops. But the reason we want to go back to the same place 3 or 4 times a year is because those veterans, whether they have post-traumatic stress or not, know where their friends that are not attending their reunions or answering their phone calls or emails are. And so they become our best recruiters.
I remember growing up, my grandfather served in the First World War, and my father in the Second World War, and they never talked about their war experience. And late in life, I took my father to the 19th Bomber Group reunion at Wright Pat in Dayton. This was in
Mhm.
2009, and I sat with him while he talked with men that he served with and others that served after him. And I heard him talk about things that I'd never heard him say before. And that interaction with other veterans was um, very moving to me. and
Hmm.
he was a turret gunner on a B-29, and at that point in time, they had a cutaway of a B-29 fuselage, and and we went through that, and he did a tour of what was in there and what he did and how he and what his role was, not just of as a turret gunner, but also as one of the ones that helped release the bombs over Japan. And it was very telling to me that my father had had an experience that he couldn't share with his family, but could only share with other veterans. And
Right.
it wasn't that he was traumatized by it, but he knew that he couldn't, there was nothing he could say that could really make us understand what he had experienced. And just
Well,
listening to
I
him
think
and his,
that's, yeah. Good. Sorry.
well, just listening to him and how he talked with his other servicemen that helped me to see that.
I think that's true, but I think that's somewhat of a limited perspective by these veterans that think that. Because
Yeah,
again, as I said, trauma feels the same. You don't have to have seen Patton to have an opinion of whether you think it's a good film. And so it is kind of a universal communications tool. And I think many of us can understand things we haven't experienced through the medium of film.
I agree with you. So what I'm saying is, I think what you're doing is really great, and I support that. And whatever I can do to help um, present this story, this message to the world, I'm glad to do it because this is this will be heard by people all over the world. It's not just an American thing, and I think being able to talk about these things is really, really important. And it kind of transcends the um, the the conflict that exists between nations that are at war with each other, and
Right.
I guess you could say that the soldiers in Ukraine and the soldiers from Russia are experiencing the same type of trauma, and they will have the same types of issues that American soldiers and others experienced coming out of the Iraq Afghanistan war.
Sure. And I think that the Russian Ukraine thing, I will take sides on that. I think we should give everything we possibly can to Ukraine. We should have done that from the beginning. But I mean, it's a very different moral dilemma there. I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. It's an existential, situation for them. And the Russians are probably struggling with whether they want to be involved. I mean, there's been a lot of
Yeah.
casualties in Russia. They say over 1 million. So they're struggling with that national interest thing as well. And hopefully, our president will step in there and stick with his guns and get this thing sorted out. So, but anyway, I really enjoy talking to you. I think you're already doing what you can do to help me. You're putting the word out there, and if people can again find me online on LinkedIn or through our website pattonvets.org or our YouTube channel, that's a great service to me.
Well, anything you want to put into the show notes, I'd be glad to do that. Just send that to me and maybe send a picture of yourself so that we can promote this. This will come out in early to mid November, and I wish you well.
Great, and by all means, I'll send you something today, and certainly let me know when it posts, and I'll put it up, through my various channels as well. Thank you so
And
much, Ed.
and anyone
Yes,
that you feel like you thinks would fare well by being on this, just send us a mutual email, and I'll send them an invitation. It'll be that simple, and we'll move forward from there.
it would be my pleasure. Well, thank you, Ed. It's
Thank you,
wonderful to
Ben.
spend time with you, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Okay, I'd like that. Bye bye.
Take care.
And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast.